So it's the early hours of the 9th of June 2020, and the issues that have been going on regarding the US protests and unrest, and protests around the UK and around many countries, primarily in the Western world, still going on, still very much a topical issue. Today's newspapers were dominated by that footage of the Edward Colston statue being toppled in Bristol. Um, I'm not going to say too much more about that, except that one could argue that the whole city of Bristol got its wealth from the slave trade. So maybe under this logic, the whole city of Bristol should be knocked down. And I'm saying that not flippantly, but it does sort of raise a topical point about where do you draw a line with the sort of moral judgment on commemoration. The thing about the Colston statue was, as I understand it, there had actually been a plaque that did point out his role in the slave trade, so I don't think we could say it was totally whitewashed or censored. But anyway, there's been some developments around these events. Mitt Romney has become the highest, most profile Republican to actively join in a Black Lives Matter demo, and he tweeted a picture of his father, George Romney, who I believe was governor of Michigan in the 60s, joining in a civil rights march. Last night I watched the film Detroit, directed by Catherine Bigelow. She's a similar style, I think, to Paul Greengrass. Very much focused on suspense, of historic drama, modern historic drama. I mean, modern history. Um, it's a powerful film. It got panned by the critics, but what are you going to do? Um, I felt it was a strong film. It starred John Boyega, Will Poulter, um, and basically, it was about the events of the 12th Street riot in Detroit in 1967. That long, hot summer, as it's called, a summer of race riots, of which Detroit was the most serious. It was about the riots, but it was specifically about an incident that happened at the Algiers Motel, in which three black teenagers were murdered. And the officers involved were acquitted. Still a very controversial issue to this day. Um, so it's basically a dramatization of those events. And the the person who John Boyega played has said it's about 99% accurate, although some of it was based on screenplay. But I think, to be fair, I think Catherine Bigelow does her homework, and I think it was a powerful film. It really gave the atmosphere. Now, the current unrest and the violence that's unfortunately been seen over the last sort of 10 days is the most serious in the United States since the Los Angeles riots in 1992 in terms of deaths. 20 plus, 20 plus people have died. 63 people died in the LA riots. So it's a very serious situation. I am somewhat concerned that the disorder could spread here. We've already seen some trouble, but it could spread further. Black Lives Matter people have been talking about pulling down statues of Churchill and Lord Nelson. I think that will inflame sentiments. You know, great figures like Nelson and Churchill did have complex biographies, there's no question about it, but I am not sure that simply tearing down statues is the way to redress history. I think it's better to just have open analysis of people's records. Churchill, for example, did have some politically incorrect, let's face it, racist views. Nevertheless, his leadership unquestionably saved this country in its darkest hour. But anyway, I digress. What I want to talk about really for this video is one of the two main subjects of these events, which is police brutality. Most of the focus has been on racism. Anthony Joshua was speaking out on that at a Black Lives Matter rally. Pretty much everyone has an opinion on this. So I'll make another video about the racism side of it, but for this I just want to talk about the issue of police power. Now, Let me start with a prefix to this, which is absolutely critical, I think. And that is, I believe that people shouldn't lose sight of the fact that police have a very difficult job. Okay. Um, it's a job in which they do risk their lives. It's a job in which they do face real dangers and pressures. I mean, you just have to look at the sort of things the Metropolitan Police have to put up with every single year. Um, and of course, they're trained for this. That's the caveat. They are trained for it. But, when you get angry protesters hurling verbal abuse at you, hurling bottles at you, missiles, and it's all sorts of situations. In normal times, it could be anything from football hooliganism to angry political demonstrations to labour disputes. Um, they're in the thick of it all the time, as is the police services of every major city in the world. So I think it is important people bear this in mind. Policing is a very, very demanding job, and the pay isn't outstanding. So I do think people need to acknowledge that as a basic point. But that doesn't mean that the police are above criticism. And what I have noticed in all of this is I've seen it on social media in some groups that I'm active on, discussion groups. There are some people, primarily on the political right, who, no matter what the situation, seem to have this knee jerk defense of the police, where they always, always, always play the devil's advocate for the police. And they don't even seem to humour the idea that actually there are corrupt officers. I actually have a theory about this. I think that within services like the police, and you probably get it to some extent in the fire brigade, certainly in the military, there will always be some people who are attracted to those professions because of a power drive. I think that a lot of officers they join the police because they see crime in society and they want to do something about it. Just like a lot of people want to get involved in politics because they see problems in society and they want to change it. Despite the overwhelming cynicism of the media, I do think most parliamentarians are motivated by honourable intentions. And people can laugh about that, but I really do think it's the case. I mean, I don't think it's money driven because if you compare a politician's salary to many other professions, it's not as much as people think. It's a lot of money, but it's certainly not as much as top media executives or sports personalities. Now, with the police, money's certainly not a motivating factor because their salary isn't great. But I do think there is a power dynamic there. I think some people feel that when they wear the uniform, they kind of have the power of God. And Will Poulter's character in the film Detroit, now it is just a film, it is based on real events, is a good example of this. He's a bit younger than the historic character he plays, but basically you see a young officer who's on a power drive. He's tense, he's agitated because, these are deadly riots. Basically, Detroit was a war zone at that time. Um, and I think the problem in America in particular is you have a militarized police who go into situations with a confrontational attitude. Now, what these right wing people tend to argue is one of the main sort of narratives they use is this person was resisting arrest. I'm pretty conservative on crime. I am well aware that there are people who do not comply with the police. They don't make things easy. And I've seen examples where police are being civil and they're asking reasonable questions, and a suspect is just being obstructionist for the sake of it. For example, I came across a video which showed a guy, and it was a case of mistaken identity. The police were questioning the wrong guy, but he was being pretty rude. I mean, he didn't just say, "Look, officer, you've made a mistake. Check my ID, and you'll see you've made a mistake," which to me would be the reasonable course of action. He was just calling them idiots. He was really, really mouthing off. Now, as it turned out, they did make a mistake. But that's an example of sometimes you do get people who are just confrontational for the sake of it. Police can make mistakes. They can, if they are looking for someone and they have a particular description, that might mean that they find someone who fits the description and it's not exactly the person. Okay. As long as the officers involved are being polite about it, then I think people should just go along with that. However, you get other situations where there are clearly abuses of power that just cannot be condoned. And there's been a number of examples of this during this unrest. Certainly, what happened in Buffalo to the elderly gentleman. I don't know how anyone can condone that, even if the officers involved weren't responsible for him falling over. The fact they just walked past him, I don't know how anyone could try and condone that. There's footage that's emerged. I'm not sure where it's from. I can't recall now. This was brought up on CNN last night. They were having law enforcement officers, a retired law enforcement officer was discussing this. And basically, the suspect appeared to be dazed, whether he was drunk or on some sort of drugs. But basically, they got him down, but the officer involved in that tasered him at close proximity repeatedly. He was clearly grimacing in pain. This was repeatedly, and it was a very close proximity. Now, my understanding is tasering is used to subdue a suspect, and it should be done from a distance, not really that close. And what this former law enforcement officer said, he's retired, was some officers are just bringing those things out, his words, like they're an extension of their arm or like handcuffs. Like they're underestimating the power of tasers. I mean, these things are designed to stun people. Um, I saw some disturbing photos of people who'd been hit by rubber bullets. What's very troubling is the number of journalists who've been caught up in the violence. Journalists are there to do a job. And whatever people think of the media, in a democracy, that is absolutely, absolutely a critical thing to have a free media that can freely cover events. Um, so if the police are being, just firing randomly at people with rubber bullets, I mean, I understand that they're trained to fire the rubber bullet at the ground so that it bounces up and hits uh, people in a less vulnerable place like their leg or their arm. But some of this footage is very troubling. I mean, anyone that thinks rubber bullets are harmless, they need to see the pictures I saw. People with like deep gashes in their heads and, serious eye wounds. Now, I'm not going to say these people have been totally innocent. Some of them may have, a lot of them will have been breaking curfews, rioting. If you're going to be an idiot, then there's going to be consequences. But I still say that there has to be a code of conduct for law enforcement officers. And when you get law enforcement officers behaving no better than criminals themselves, basically vigilantes, that's a serious problem. Another footage emerged from, I think it was Sacramento, or it was a Californian city. I believe it was either San Jose or Sacramento. I can't recall now. But suspect, that guy had his hands over his head. Officer behind him just kicked him. Now he already had his hands over his head, so clearly, even if he was armed, he couldn't have done much. That just seemed unnecessary. It just seemed like a way of, oh well, we've got the guy now, I'm going to kick him. It just seemed totally unnecessary. Police officers are human beings, of course. They're subject to stress, they're subject to anger, they're subject to all those things. But I do think one thing that's come out of all of this is a real question mark about training techniques. And I think another issue that's come out is the power of police unions. This was brought up by this former law enforcement officer. He made the point that there needs to be questions about how much political influence they have. I mean, if you look at the situation, Politicians who criticise police brutality, they're immediately pounced on by these police unions and accused of being anti-police. Bill de Blasio has been on the receiving end of that after the Eric Garner situation in New York City. Uh, the NYPD's police union really, went out of their way to try and destroy him politically. There were officers that turned their back on him at an event. But my observation about that would be that politicians are elected by the people. It's their responsibility to speak out when public servants like the police are abusing their position. These police unions seem to want politicians to basically just be like their political wing, their political spokespeople. Bill de Blasio or any other mayor, um, their job is to represent all the people of their city. So I do think there's important questions about the power that police unions have. Of course, you would expect them to defend the police. That's their unions for the police. That's what you would expect them to do. But sometimes it seems that they will defend anything just for the sake of it. So after the George Floyd situation, they were saying, "Oh, don't just rush to judgment." Even police bodies, because this is a thing that's important to recognize. The United States is not one big homogenous police unit. There's literally thousands of different forces. Some have better records than others of social cohesion. The same in the UK. Some forces have better reputations than others. Um, but I do have a problem with people who have this mentality that there's basically no moral red lines on what the police do. If that's your position, if you think that officers of the law are always in the right just because they're wearing a uniform, you're basically endorsing a police state mentality. And here's the thing with policing by consent. What is it? Well, it's a case of we entrust these people in a very difficult job to uphold the law and to apprehend criminals, keep the public safe. And they can't do that all the time. There's a range of factors to do with funding and so on. So I'm not convinced that defunding the Minneapolis police as some people have been calling for, is the right idea. I don't think that will help matters. But it, there is a lot of questions as to how the police operate. But I do not accept this argument that some people say, "Oh well, people complain about the police, but then they need them when there's crimes." Well, yes, but I do not think it's unreasonable to say, look, we want you to apprehend criminals, but don't abuse your power. I don't think that is putting them in an unwinnable position. Um, if, for example, you get a dangerous armed criminal, I would support the police 110% in taking that person on. If you get rioters who are throwing Molotov cocktails at the police, vandalizing things, you can't expect the police to just stand there and take it. I support them taking hardline actions. Certainly non-lethal. Certainly, I would be wary about the usage of rubber bullets, but water cannon, I think within reason use. I think truncheons within reason use. You know, everything needs to be done in a way that is responsible but controlling, and it's very important to get this balance. Um, Otherwise, you get situations where innocent people get caught up. And also officers themselves get injured because it escalates the situation. So I don't accept this argument that you're either for the police or you're against them in terms of, like, if you criticize police brutality, then you're anti-police. I think it's perfectly consistent to be very pro-police and say most of them are decent people who are in it for the right reasons, but corrupt cops need to be held to account. I don't think that's controversial. And I hold the same attitude, by the way, about the military. I mean, some people, again on the right, think if you criticize individual corrupt soldiers, then you're somehow anti military. I think when you get, thousands of people just by math, just by the law of physics, you're going to get some of them who may well be in it for the wrong reasons. And they might be a very small minority. But that's why, for example, when I hear about British troops being accused of abuses, I can't endorse this mentality that, oh, how dare people raise questions? They're unpatriotic, they're anti-troops, they, etc., etc. And I won't focus too much on this because it's not the main point of the video. But the thing about a lot of the abuse claims in Iraq and Afghanistan, the particular lawyer involved in that has been discredited for embellishing a lot of the reports and paying people to get false information. I believe his name was Philip Shiner. That meant that a lot of these soldiers were put through legal hell when they were innocent. Problem is, though, it shouldn't send out a message that all claims are always false. There are some bad soldiers. There are some people in the military, some people in the police who are bad apples. That's irrefutable. And I think it would be wrong to present it as being anti-military or anti-police by calling them out and saying these people need to be held to account. Um, in my opinion, there is never ever an excuse for someone in uniform to abuse a power ever. Um, if they're dealing with a violent protester, that's a different matter. But when they are apprehending someone, there is a basic principle about behaving in a responsible way. Because as soon as what I would say to those apologists is as soon as you start saying that every time a police officer is involved in this, let's just play the devil's advocate and assume the suspect was resisting arrest or assume the officer is in the right. If that's your mentality, then firstly, you should hope you're never caught up in that sort of situation. Secondly, just consider that in democracies, power of the police is mandated by the public. They are public servants after all. Um, they're in a dangerous, difficult job, and I think that needs to be understood. Blue lives matter. But when police abuse a partner, it isn't necessarily just in terms of brutality. It can also be in terms of like some of the things we've seen during this lockdown, like South Yorkshire police, for example, going into a man's own garden and telling him he couldn't be in his lawn. That sort of thing looks like abuse of power. Well, it is abuse of power, and I think the public, if they're paying attention, would be very concerned about it. So, summed up, I do not think it's unreasonable to say, look, we need to give these people the resources they need to use. We need to recognise they're in a difficult job, but it isn't anti-police to insist that they behave with a certain code of conduct. And if they don't, they shouldn't be above the law. That has to be a fundamental principle here. There cannot be one rule for the police and another for everyone else. And I think that's what fueled a lot of the anger in the US is the perception has very much been that when a cop does it, they get away with it. That cannot be right. And I'm not saying that's true of every situation. I mean, in this case, all officers involved have been arrested, as they should be. But for, too often we've seen a situation where officers are simply put on desk duty, whereas any ordinary civilian would be arrested. So there has to be a message of from the police themselves, we will hold corrupt officers to account. Because I think this is a very, very fundamental question of liberty and democracy. And I do not think it makes you anti police to point that out. In fact, if anything, it's pro police because it also makes their job easier by improving the social cohesion that they need to work with. Because one of the things that caused those urban riots in the 60s was the situation of having black ghettos and all white police forces, I think the situation's improved a lot since then. There's a lot more black officers, but it's far from perfect either on either side of the Atlantic. So yeah, that's my thoughts. Thanks for watching.